In 2023, Queenstown Wallboards will open its new jib plasterboard manufacturing and distribution facility in Tauriko, Tauranga. Tauranga is New Zealand's fifth largest city and is the fastest growing regional economy. It is New Zealand's fastest growing regional job market and home to the largest, most efficient port in the country. The new Queenstown Wallboards plant will be based at the Tauriko Business Park, 10 kilometres from Tauranga City. It will be built on 12.8 hectares of land, making it 2.5 times bigger than the current site. Designed with sustainability at the forefront, this plant will be a significant step forward towards Fletcher Building's goal of reducing carbon emissions by 2030. The new plant will have extensive recycling capability on site for water and waste. It will also include new state-of-the-art technology and equipment, enabling the business to manufacture the full range of our jib plasterboard products with a high degree of flexibility. Automated processes will also ensure increased enhancement of the safety and manufacturing processes. The new Queenstown Wallboards facility reinforces our commitment to manufacturing in New Zealand, and we look forward to sharing this journey with you.
Tēnā tātou katoa. Good evening and welcome everyone. My name is Yi-Ting Chong. I'm a lecturer at the School of Architecture and Planning and is the host for today's Fast Forward talk. Many of you may already be familiar about our Fast Forward lecture. It is a lecture our school hosts annually. We're aiming to foster debates, discussions within the discipline of architecture, urban design, and urban planning, and provide a platform for professional practitioners, academics, and students like you to exchange and share ideas through these events. And I would like to express a special thank you to our sponsor, JIB. This is well-known and respected event in the community, would not be possible without our generous sponsor, JIB, and also the support of New Zealand Institute of Architects. Today, at the third lecture of the year, we'll be zooming into the topic of urban design, transportation, and growth management in the COVID world. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Lee Beattie, currently is the head of the School of Architecture and Planning at the University of Auckland and the director of the University Urban Design Program. Dr. Beattie is a practicing urban designer and urban planner with over 27 years of experience and is actively involved in various roles with city councils across Aotearoa. Dr. Beattie will be sharing with us his recent work on insights of transit-oriented development concepts and stress the importance of refocusing on local accessibility to support greater social and economic resilience in our urban environment. And during the lecture, please feel free to ask any questions through the chat or Q&A. We hope to have an exciting discussion with you all at the end of the talk. And without any further ado, Dr. Beattie will take the floor. Thank you, Lee.
Thank you very much, Yi-Ting, and thanks very much for making your time. And again, I just want to reinforce the importance of our sponsorship with JIB to the school, and it's great to have you here, and the importance of the lecture theatre. Thanks very much for your introduction. I'd like to explore this whole concept of interregional travel, TODs and such like. So I think the whole COVID-19 pandemic shone a light on the associated risks of dealing with TODs. And when I'm talking about TODs, I'm talking about transit-oriented developments. And we'll explain as we go along through the talk today what we mean by that and how those things are applied in Calthorpe's ideas and the different types of TODs. Noting we would probably question if there's any real TODs in New Zealand anyway, or Auckland anyway. And that's part of the issue we'd like to explore with you. Having said that, TODs are sort of seen as an alternative to private vehicle trip dependency and are promoted for a range of planning documents, urban planning documents in New Zealand, district plans, RPSs, NPSs, regional policy statements, and all sorts of things. But what we'd really like to talk about is, as we go along, is that these outcomes still really promote the idea of daily commutes, long distance travel, and promote those more strategic types of TODs, and we'll talk about the different types of TODs in a moment, opposed to those local types of things and the return to the local, which is the key theme of what we're talking about today. And we've really seen the impact of COVID-19 on the effectiveness of public transport, and the serious social and economic consequences of this. Auckland Transport and the Auckland Council are in financial problem with people not choosing to go back onto public transport as well. And, a lot of what we find here at the university, a lot of the students are choosing to stay home and not come in. But the key thing that I think we'd like to push today is, and I think this goes for all of us about many different things in life, is that this pandemic really provided us with an opportunity to really sit back and challenge the orthodoxies of what we've actually been doing, and actually really think about how we plan and develop our urban spaces, and really go and try and give effect to these ideas that we've been talking about by reducing travel demand generally and interregional travel. In doing so, we'd like to suggest that let's return to the local and actually try and achieve on these growth management, urban design outcomes that we've been talking about for a long period of time. And we'll give you some examples as we go along to actually create those meaningful, local, sustainable and resilient communities that don't require travel. And we're not anti-travel, as we'll talk along. It's just about reducing that travel demand, because you're still going to need travel to come to places like where we are. Eting and I are sitting in our offices here at the university. So we're still going to need those types of things. And just to say, there's my local high street, and this was really interesting. This was phase 3 lockdown, and this is when we're all finally allowed to get out. And this is my neighbour there, it's in front of the local cafe there, going to the coffee shop. And this is Eating's local coffee shop, which is not far away, obviously in Mount Eden. And again, just showing some ideas of our local streets and such like, and trying to provide those local services so we don't have to move. So while we're sort of talking about this from an Auckland point of view, we'd argue that these issues apply to different degrees throughout New Zealand. And I think, the key thing we're trying to say here is some of the worst things we could do is just return to the business as usual. And I know we all want to get back to normality, whatever normal actually was or is. You can see that in here at the university, some of the students don't want to wear masks and all that sort of stuff. But I think, as I say, it's a real opportunity for us to really think about how we want to do things. And I think, all of us in the built form professions, whether it's architecture, urban design, or urban planning, or landscape architecture, whatever the case may be, that requires strong leadership from us, and to capture that narrative that moves away from, it's all about return, but it's about actually creating these types of things. And it's easy to do that. And the whole point of it in many ways about this talk is to be a bit provocative and challenges some of those ideas. So as Eating said just at the beginning there's a lot of opportunity for us to have an interactive session at the end and time for discussion. So please feel free to come through with any questions and discussions that we can have then, just as we did last week when we were talking about light rail here in Auckland. I think what also COVID-19 has sort of brought home, and I think we've all sort of noticed this, isn't it, is that how unresilient many parts of our urban systems actually are. And it's also highlighted some of those key underlying problems that exist in our society, access to affordable housing, homelessness, issues of equity, and access to technology and education. And that's really brought home in that university space that Eating and other of our colleagues here at the university have discovered, that trying to teach a design studio or an urban design studio or an architecture studio on Zoom doesn't work very, very well, just first off. And then you've got questions about, do the students actually have access to the broadband and the computers in the house, or is it one computer per house, and all those types of issues of equity that really brought home to us. So it's sort of highlighted those problems and brought it to the fore. Plus, as we've sort of noticed, there's sort of been winners and losers out of the system. Also, the very high cost of social dislocation that these lockdowns and all those sort of things brought on us, and just generally the dislocation of people away from services and such like, can have a huge social cost, especially having got access to those services that we're going to talk about. And so the cost of travel, and when we think about travel, we've got to think about the equity of travel. Who can afford to travel and the cost of that? And people now talk about, the cost of public transport. Is it too prohibitive, to actually encourage movement and such like? And we all know about the cost of actually physically owning a private vehicle, how expensive it really, really is. So we would like to talk about these sort of things. And I think, just as Eating said, we actually changed the title of this presentation on today because we thought about and realized it's actually not a post-COVID world, it's actually a COVID world we live in. And I think we're going to be in it for a long period of time. It's not going to be something that's sort of disappeared, even though it's moved out of the mainstream media's sort of thinking. I think it's going to be with us for a long period of time. So what we're really talking about here from an urban design point of view is not at the site or block level, but we're really talking about neighborhood creation. And except when we're talking about public realms, public streets, and those larger master plan sites might be slightly different. We're talking about those types of things. We're not talking about sites or blocks in per se. And I've just put some pictures up to break it up. There's the Pearl District in Portland, Oregon, and there's Hummerfield and Stockholm there. And I'll talk about the photos as we go along. Just on that, we had a lot of discussion. I put up this photo here just to be a bit cheeky. That's in Lugano in the Italian part of Switzerland, just to show you different types of urban form. But coming back to what we should be talking about, all the issues around, successful community creation are still relevant. All of the things that we as urban designers and architects and urban planners would talk about are still really relevant as we move forward. But we're just really talking about this concept of how we move around the city, of that more big picture issue. And just to highlight some of our student work that we have here in the urban design program, that's some student work from a few years ago down the bottom there, looking at how you could redevelop the old council depot site there in Hobsonville, in Hobson Street. It's really interesting, isn't it? We sit back and think about things. We've been talking about these key urban design, urban planning sort of messages for the last 50 years, get out of cars, use public transport, get into the bus, the train, that sort of thing. We've sort of moved in now, talked about active travel options, cycling and walking. And, those health benefits of those are incredibly well known. And, from an urban design point of view, that's something that we really want to push as our relationship with health sciences and push the benefits of well-designed communities. Getting out of cul-de-sacs, talk about connected neighbourhoods, connected networks, grids, conductivity, legibility, all those sort of things. Moving away from the Euclidean types of zoning approaches, to the monocultures of that's a residential zone, that's a business zone, we've got to separate them. And, and all the rationale for those thinkings as we had back in the turn of the 20th century were relevant at the time, but not anymore, but get us to move into the more mixed use and more type of spaces. And there's been operated this, there's many types of models that have come forward, new urbanism, smart growth, but I'd just like to clarify for the minutes that both Eating and I are not new urbanists, not in no shape or form. But having said that, the underlying principles that sit behind what they were trying to achieve are pretty sound. We just don't support the way that those guys were thinking about achieving that with false reconstructions on architectural reconstructions of the past and such like. But anyway, those concepts are sound in what they were trying to achieve. However, probably what we'd argue in the New Zealand context is Calthorpe's concept of transit-oriented development, and that's where we started with, probably best encapsulates and reflects what a lot of New Zealand plans, district plans, regional policy statements, all of those council-based, government-based plans that are looking at intensification, where we're talking about intensification along corridors and nodes. But I think it's really, really important. This is the point that we're trying to get to through this whole discussion, as they've been a bit provocative, is to remember that TODs are just about local employment as they are about interregional, about movement, so that people can live and work and play in their local spaces. And that's fundamentally what they were about. And it does frustrate us many times when people talk about housing. It's not a housing crisis, it's a community construction crisis. It's about providing all those types of options so that people can live and work and play in their local spaces. And that picks up the point that we're talking about. There are different versions of TODs. And these pictures here are from Aranco in Portland, which is one of the sort of case studies. And I'll show you actually in the case study that Calthorpe based a lot of his ideas upon. This is out on the blue line, and it's actually where Nike is based, the head office is there. But as you can see, looking down at his diagram there below, he really talks about different types of TODs. And as you can see from this, what he thinks goes into these things. And so you've got the urban TOD, or the more strategic TOD, if you like, the more thing that's got, more employment. But even the local neighborhood TOD, as you can see in the diagram on the left, really shows the need for employment. And see how the civic and public spaces stay about the same. So really important, reinforcing that it was just not about interregional travel. It was not about just having a station, some housing around it, and people move somewhere else for their jobs. It was all about providing opportunities for that to take place in these spaces. Really, really important. And, if we think about what he was talking about, a seminal piece of work, and I encourage you, if you've never read it, actually have a good read of this, the next American metropolis, he talks about these ideas, and it was an alternative, and it was a reaction to urban sprawl. It was picking up those environmental movements. It was picking up those concepts that were going on. Also, we're talking about peak oil, all those types of things as a reaction to those types of things. But, you know, he's talking about being able to, you know, walking distance to jobs, just as I showed in that diagram, to jobs, civic services, retail, amenities, civic amenities, all those types of things. But as this photo says here, and if I just put my cursor up, he shows the different types of TODs so that you can move to those larger scale TODs if you needed to do, but still the idea of this local based types of things as well. And the understanding of the hierarchical relationships that goes on with these movement strategies that he was talking about. But I just really want to drill home, and no disrespect in any shape or form, these concepts are not new. You know, we've been talking about these concepts from, you know, Ebenezer Howard's sort of concepts. When you talked about his garden cities, you know, you go right back to his idea of this model city of 32,000 people. And he went in right down into the detail about even the body corporate arrangements and how they should be financed and all these sort of things. And then you pick up Letchworth, you know, in England, you know, Raymond Irwin's concepts of what he tried to create there, same types of things as you can see, except that we do have that land use sort of scenario going on, which is a reflection of its time. But still, as you can see there, the commercial areas, the residential areas, the shops, the commercial, the industrial, the green belts, all those types of things, but linked with rail back, and of course, being in the UK or the English example, linked back into London, again, showing those sort of concepts. And, you know, we've manifested them, as I say, in the New Zealand context. This is the Auckland plan, and we'll move on to the Auckland plan 2050 in a moment. But there's where I went to high school as a kid down there at the bottom there. You know, people probably don't realise, but that little diagram's around Papatoe train station, and that's where I went to school as I went to high school. But anyway, we sort of conceptualised those ideas about livable, walkable, urban regeneration, transit-oriented development. But just as a side, it's really interesting that the Auckland Unitary Plan never actually talks about TODs. It never mentions it per name, but that underlying thinking underpins its type of thinking. Really interesting, just as a side, for the people that don't know, the whole concept of the 800-metre circle is in many ways traces its origins back to Perry when he was thinking in the 1930s, when he was thinking about what actually makes a community. And the whole idea of the quarter mile and kids walking to primary schools, and primary schools became, in his thinking, the centre of the community, and they are for many people. And that's where the concept of the quarter mile, the 400 metres, extended out engagement, those concepts come back to his ideas of community creation. Anyway, back to what we're talking about in terms of growth management, because as I said, this whole concept of TODs is framed in this bigger picture of urban growth management. And as I said right at the beginning, or as we're saying right at the beginning, we've been talking about this for a long period of time, you know, nearly sort of, you know, going back to the first statutory, if we think of it in a statutory sense opposed to a conceptual sense, but we could go right back to the original 1956 transportation plan if we wanted to, which set out the motorway system for Auckland, which we could go back to that, which only now, if you think about it, here we are sort of, you know, sort of 60, 70 years down the track, are we actually giving effect to the final outcomes of that plan as we link State Highway 18 to State Highway 1 up there at Constellation Drive, such like. But anyway, back to our first sort of real statutory type of concept. There's the 1974 regional district scheme as it was at the time, as the terminology they used, showing the key things, where the nodes were, the connections between them. Fast forward to the Auckland Growth Management Forum, Growth Forum, 1999, again, sort of highlighting these sort of key points. Really interesting, as you've noticed, if you can look at these diagrams in a bit more detail, I should have put them on individual slides in a way. You can actually see that as we move from 1999 through to the Auckland Plan in 2012, 13 years down the track, how all the land that was associated for 50 years of peripheral growth has all been taken up by that point. Interesting, we've sort of favoured that greenfield growth over the intensification. But again, the same sort of concepts. But the Auckland Plan really did focus the idea of the CBD, obviously acknowledging the Southern initiative that went on, but again, focusing this idea along towards and corridors and movement and such like. Fast forward to the Auckland 2050 plan. And it's really interesting that it's hard to find a similar comparative plan, but the sort of plans that you do find just reinforce this idea of interregional movement as well. So really, really interesting, showing that the concept of growth management is not new. We've been thinking about this, and the idea of trying to encourage development around centres is not new. And we're not alone, you know, as you cruise around the Pacific Rim, especially if you look at jurisdictions similar to ours, Auckland, similar to the Canadian spaces, the American spaces, the Australian spaces, all got First Nations, Indigenous, mana whenua issues, car-orientated sort of societies, settled from a colonial point of view around the same sort of time, same legislative systems, all have the same type of approaches, and just to say Christchurch has followed as well, very similar type of approach. It's really interesting though, when you get into the detail, is how they've operated and give effect to that. And they've taken more of the approach that we're going to sort of argue today and in their implementation approaches. As I said, the Auckland Regional Growth Strategy, that 1999 document, really accepted that we needed to, break this sort of, stop this break between residential and employment planning, and somehow they were separate from each other, and trying to bring these back. And in many ways, this is a reflection that places like the old Waitakere City, and that's reflected in their whole idea of sustainability that flew out of this, was that they were just a dormant suburb to Auckland City across the bridge there in New Land type of thing. But if we even dissect the idea of what we talk about the Auckland Unitary Plan, we still encourage the higher densities at edges like Hobsonville, and they still have this strategic approach to TODs opposed to this local type of approach to TODs. And we talk about that in metropolitan centres. Really interesting, and we're not going to talk much about the medium density housing provisions and such like that come out of the Housing Enabling Act, changes to the RMA. But it's interesting how, if you think about what they're actually doing, they're actually diffusing development out, opposed to concentrating around walkable catchments in some ways. But anyway, that's another story. So this really creates this high base, nodes, mass transit by bus and rail rather than car type of idea. It would be very interesting though, in which we don't have in our planning documents, is objectives that actually talk about reducing average commuter distances. There are some there, but not to the level that we probably should be thinking about. Imagine if we started to think about linking every house to a job. So we could actually start thinking about this stuff. And if you think that's really difficult, I remember working with a colleague who's now retired, Professor Errol Half, where we looked at the city of Wiltshire in Melbourne, and that was their fundamental concern, was that the same thing, like I was talking about with Waitakere and Auckland City, they were concerned about being a dormant commuter suburb to everyone going into Melbourne. So they introduced this whole idea of one job, one house, really trying to reduce that need for movement, which comes at quite a significant cost if we think about it. The investment in, and we talked about last week when we're talking about light rail, and we're quite supportive of that, but figures are around $14 billion. These are not cheap investments. Or we talk about a new motorway, we talk about Transmission Gully, we talk about Waterview tunnels. How much money does all this sort of cost to have this interregional travel ideas? As I say, it comes at a significant financial cost that we have to think about. We have put emphasis into walking catchments, but I don't think we've really thought about that. And that comes back to my comment about the medium housing density. What type of density and land use mixes we really need to achieve this type of outcome in practice. And, we've probably argued that we've focused our thinking on TODs on the major rail and major, busways and such like, and limit our thinking to encouraging this more interregional travel. So we are still with this idea of somehow the housing there and the employment zone there. And this is encouraging us to move. Instead of returning all of those things, as I said, back to the concept of a local TOD, back to the local, and encouraging all those services and employment opportunities to be provided at the local level. Acknowledging, inherently it's about choice. We can't enforce people to do that, but it's enabling those sort of things to come through. And it's really brought home, COVID-19 has really brought home the dependency on this commuter travel, and also the significant costs that we've invested in these types of commuter travel options. We can all remember the picture of no one on the Northern Motorway, no one on the Southern Motorway. These huge resources just sitting there not being used. Also, we think about the cost of this, because not everyone can work from home. So we would argue this is probably an inherent weakness in our thinking, where we've focused on those strategic interregional issues instead of trying to focus on these local types of TODs and trying to encourage that type of form. And I know some people have talked about density being dead and all that sort of stuff. We would fundamentally challenge that premise. To us, that's just a management issue. it's, you know, it's about how you manage these types of things. And you can look at cities like Taipei, for instance, before, you know, in the first couple of rounds of COVID, successfully managed those types of things. Inherently, people are social things, so I don't think it's an issue about everyone going back and living in lifestyle blocks, as someone was suggesting. That's just not what we're talking about. However, though, it is about those bigger question points about all density is not good. It's about ensuring that we have the high quality design outcomes that comes with this and underpins those things that we're talking about, which were those basic urban design principles that we said are still valid today. It's still valid as part of our discussions. So what happens if we can't socially distance and use the PT system appropriately, you know? And we did see that for a while. People were one bus, you know, you only have one seat. Again, not making these economic, not that they're economic now, but making them less economic, if you like. And in many ways, that sort of came back to the criticism of new urbanism, landscape urbanism, and all those things I've just talked about how our idea of disconnecting and just spreading people out, which we wouldn't support. So if we think about this, we do create this future traps where people simply can't afford to travel, either because they don't have cars and they can't afford to travel because we're locked into these types of spaces and we've based them into their need to move, or the motorway system simply can't handle it. And I probably argue we're pretty far off this. And the cost of that is just, you know, as we've talked about, the significant costs that go with it, especially in our major centres like Auckland. But you're also starting to see that in Christchurch and even in Wellington as well. So I think this gives us an opportunity to really rethink the form of urban form we're doing to try and encourage that local type of thing and return to those underlying concepts that support, which we talked about, Calthorpe's idea about jobs, civic amenities that support those local TODs, opposed to encouraging those more regional, interregional travel and encouraging people to move to their employment opportunities or to their retail opportunities or to their, you know, whatever there are. But in saying that, there's always going to be there's always going to be need for some form of travel, depending on what it is. I think part of the problem is we've always looked at this as all growth as types of good type of approach. And it's, as we've highlighted in those pictures when we put those growth management strategies up, it's easier to develop at the periphery. It is easier, and we'll take that because we think all growth is good and it's dealing with housing crises and all those types of things. But I don't think we've really understood the metrics that sit behind all this and what we're actually trying to achieve and whether this is actually good enough. And I know there's challenges about brownfield growth, but I think those are the challenges that we have to overcome. Because, you know, if you look at this empirically and start thinking about densities and catchments to make things actually work, you know, you're really talking about 200 dwellings per hectare. You know, if you think about how many dwellings do you need to make the local coffee shop work, you know, well, I put up my local coffee shop where I live, where density is about 50 to 60 dwellings per hectare. Eating's not too far off that. You can start to get some sense of walkability in that. But I can't really see that happening. And again, coming back to what the policy approaches we seem to be taking now. But however, we do sort of think about this a bit more strategically. You know, we can think about e-mobility and all those types of things. And that might enable us to think about densities at 25 to 30 dwellings per hectare, which we actually can achieve, and we are achieving achieving these outer type of spaces. So it might mean we might have to think more strategically about how we deal with these types of things. But our inherent premise would be, let's return to try and get as much density as we can around these types of the centres in terms of employment. Think about the range of uses that we're going with, those types of things that go with that. And we need to start prioritising our investment, not in those massive big infrastructure projects, but in those local things that will encourage that movement to take place. And the last thing we just wanted to kick off before we throw it over to questions, because we thought we'd talk for about half an hour, 35 minutes, and then we'd throw the floor open to questions, given we were trying to encourage debate, was we really need to move away from this car-based, you know, type of thing that we're talking about. And we talked about TODs, transit-orientated development. A lot of what we're talking about here is actually CODs, car-orientated development, where we're locking people in to private trip movement. And we'd probably argue that, you know, while movement to EVs is a very positive thing, it doesn't deal with congestion, it doesn't deal with the underlying issues we were just talking about. And then, of course, there are a fundamental question about where all the energy comes to run those things has to be thought through as well. So just returning to our underlying premise, we'd say that COVID has provided us with a really strong opportunity to think about how we invest, image, and how we deal with our cities, And instead of encouraging, which we seem to be doing, returning to this idea of everyone moving around again, and again, we're not saying not all movement's bad, but encouraging and providing opportunities so that people can return to their local spaces, can have it so people can live, work and play in these centres, these local TODs, without having the need to move. So we'll stop there, and both of us are here to answer any questions and any provocative things that came out of what we're trying to raise today, which is sort of a counterbalance to what Lee Orton and the others were talking about light rail. Again, they talked about very quickly, unfortunately, not in the level of detail, is what they were trying to do with that light rail was leverage off these TODs, create these types of things that do connect as part of that whole idea of the light rail project. So I'll open up to any questions. Do we have any questions, any comments, any discussions? And both of us are here to answer any of these questions as we go along. But anyway,
Yes.
that's the premise.
Hi,
Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. We have 3 questions. We'll start from the first one. Is transit-oriented development really a distinctive notion, a model that occurs in just some locations, or is it fundamentally just good planning? And if so, should we not just call it the good planning? And what is really stopping us realizing that?
Oh, I think there's an interesting question about, and also which we didn't talk about here, is, and that's the idea of a local TOD. And I put in the example of Orenco. And if you looked at how it actually plays out, the travel option is actually at the edge of centre. It's not actually in the centre, it's the edge of centre. Because we've got a serious question. I think that's some of the things we get caught up with, these interregional travel TODs ideas, or somehow we have heavy rail and we'll put a train station on it, and then we'll put all the stuff around it, and it's got this huge dislocation issue. And a lot of the current thinking is that you probably want to put this edge of centre. But picking up your point, it is good. And I don't know why we haven't been implementing these things that we've been talking about. And, I could put up policy frameworks that have been talking about this right back from 74, or even, 74 through to the regional growth management strategy, through to the unitary plan, through to the Auckland plan. Yeah, I agree with you. Why aren't we doing this? I think there's a strong favour of what we're sort of talking about, this desire to return to what we know, instead of actually, as us all as built form professionals, talking about the underlying concepts and benefits of trading off these types of living environments. People tend to favour the idea of the quarter acre section, that's sort of gone now in the Auckland context, but people look back to those sort of things without us, and that's the challenge we put out there, is what are we as built form professionals capturing the narrative and telling people about the benefits of changing different types of typologies. We think about, we go overseas and we go to Europe, we go to Taipei or Taiwan, wherever we want. With Yiting and I, both adjunct professors at the university there. You go to a place like that, the CAF below, and same in the Italian country in Europe, is an extension to your house. It's part of your kitchen. The local playground is where all your kids meet and play. Why aren't we thinking about those types of things? So yeah, I would agree.
Right. I think fundamentally people here are really enjoy the car dependency. Transferring from a car dependency society to a more higher density living needs a little transition and time. I think what we're trying to do is to communicate that ideas through. And I think slowly, I think people are more adapting to it, right? Lee, you would say?
Yeah. And I think that's where we all have to do, show the benefits and capture the narrative. It's interesting when the mainstream media just wants to talk about housing crisis. Now it's a cost of living crisis and what really frustrates me, and I was at the environmental law conference last week, we were talking about consenting with climate change, is how we've disconnected that whole discussion of climate change with urban form. Urban form is the key driver here, isn't it? We're talking about things that are going to be here for hundreds of years. Why are we enabling people to do this? And why isn't that whole discussion going forward in the media about the impacts of urban form to reduce travel demand? We didn't talk about climate change through this discussion because we take it as a given, but that's one of the major upsides, is reducing that whole need to use, and climate impacts.
Yeah. The second one is not really a question. It's just saying that Enable Housing Act mentioned tier 1 cities and encourage higher density within 200 meters from public transport hubs, and therefore not advocating sprawl, but to build from the AUP and standard increase in the suburban area. So it's just sort of a statement. what the Enabling Housing Act mentioned.
I mean, just aside, it's really interesting, isn't it? You sort of think the Auckland Unitary Plan, and you can see that manifesting itself in the city now, that, these things are not short run things, that old thing, it doesn't happen overnight, but it will happen. It's taken, the Unitary Plan's been in place for 8 years, no, 6 years, sorry, 6 years. And you really seem to see the impact of that, We are really trying to do it around the centres. We are really trying to do these things. And so it's a really interesting question. Would have Auckland really achieved this, and does the Unitary Plan enable more housing anyway? So, but we're not really talking about that, but it's an interesting question.
Yeah. And the next one, considering that TOD is important, the consideration of intensity post-Wallace as a matter of notification, and the chronic avoidance of notification through design choices of many developers in New Zealand. How can we encourage intensive developments when it frequently risks notification?
Look, it's really interesting. For the people who don't know what Jordan, thanks Jordan, a very good question, is talking about. It's a recent High Court decision about how you deal, and I won't go into the ins and outs of it, but there's a recent High Court decision on judicial review of a council's decision to non-notify a medium housing density application in, I've forgotten the street, it's not Upland Road, it's Retna Road, I think. And the court really criticised in many ways, and the court's entitled to that. It's not for me to criticise the justice involved, but basically, simplistically challenged the premise that the Unitary Plan is based on, is that future plan character, future amenity, intensification is a good thing. We should be encouraging that, type of thing. And the judge was a bit critical of that and the idea of intensity and density and such like. I think the key thing that comes out of this, and in many ways reinforces the need to have, and this is a bit of planning speak for those people not involved in it, is to have those right non-notification provisions built into the plan. And I think the next stuff that comes through as we do the plan changes to the Auckland Unitary Plan to give effect to the Housing Supply Enabling Act and such like, I think that will be forefront of their thinking, is the implications of that decision and how we can get around that issue. How do we deal with that? But with that, I think is that bigger question about community engagement and taking that narrative, taking people with us. It's interesting, just as a side, I, in my other life as a commissioner, got judicial review too, based on that decision. And my understanding is that it got withdrawn because money changed hands, but also the people realised that what was proposed was probably better than what could have come under the medium housing density provision. So it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. But I think it's a really beholden on the plan makers to make sure that we build those provisions in there to have those non-notification provisions built in.
Right. Oh. Okay, the next question is, TOD discussion tend to focus on zoning far more than movement. Local and city scale, we seem to continuously avoid the awkward question around the blockage to transforming movement. How do we fix this in the context of Auckland?
Oh, I agree. You go, Eating, what you think, but I agree. I think we tend to too much think on the land use zoning approaches, and we're not linking that with the funding and how we actually deal with these sort of things. How do we encourage movement strategies? How do we move beyond the site? I totally agree. I mean, I know you've got some strong views on this, Eating.
No, I mean, I just think this is a chicken and egg question. Like, you want to get enough people to be there to make the infrastructure sufficient enough and put money into the investment. But then if you don't have the infrastructure, then people won't come. So that's kind of like the balancing act that you always would need to focus and trying to balance off. But yeah, definitely, I agree. I think because transformation, I guess transportation problems are much difficult to tackle with at the moment because it's really serious. So yeah, I don't know the answer to how we fix it, but I think Auckland is moving forward with the light rail proposal and maybe implementing more public transportation and strategies to solve the problems. But yeah, don't have an answer for that.
And I think with that is that linkage of infrastructure provision, transportation provision, and some honest questions about what we're actually funding and what we're funding. And again, that's that premise of returning to what we know and what we do, and Why do we fund that? And why don't we fund that? And that's that narrative, you know. People talk about, oh, I've lost my car parking spaces in front of my dairy, instead of, well, actually, if we had enough density, you'd actually have more people engaging in your spaces, assuming we've designed it well, of course. It's that type of discussion. Bruce, oh, hello, Bruce, how are you? Good to see you. Good to have a question from you. Oh, I think the answer to your question is talking about, you know, the massive imbalance, and that comes right back to what we did before. We were talking about, and he said, how does Auckland overcome the massive imbalance between employment and residential areas, presuming the more local employment will take decades or longer to achieve? Yeah, and I totally accept that. You know, we've made those conscious decisions. We go back to the thinking that sits behind it, you know, environmental health reasons, all that Euclidean zoning types of thinking, which we don't have time to talk about, you know, really, really well. It will take time. And that's the thing, is my comment about the Auckland Energy Plan, 6 years down the track, we're starting to see the results of these sort of things. What I'm sort of saying is, let's use this as a crisis, or potentially as a crisis that COVID provided us, to start making those transitions, to make those choices. And yeah, I'm with you. It's not going to happen overnight, but it will happen over time. What's the difference between transit adjacent? And that's what I was just sort of saying. A lot of discussion now about, do you have your transit line, especially if it's quite a heavy rail, or if it's quite a big piece of infrastructure kit, do you have that edge of centre adjacent to, opposed to putting it in the high street? Because if you have, and there's a lot of discussion about that, the Australians, especially in Sydney, are really thinking about that the light rail at grade option's completely different. And if you go back to what Carl thought was thinking about with those local TODs, they were light rail types of options, not those heavy rail, because you create those huge severance issues. You know, you create heavy rail, 4 tracks, if you like, stationed on top, and unless you can build over it and have the massive density, which you can in some of those Australian spaces and American spaces, it creates that huge disconnection of crossing it all the time and creating 2 halves of the thing. So there's a lot of discussion now thinking about what type of TOD you're talking about, where's the best place to put it, and that's an adjacent sort of TOD idea.
Are TOD contrary to public transport infrastructure drivers and investments?
No, I mean, we're sort of saying that, you know, it's a different types of TODs. You've still got to have investment in movement. You've got to have that, because just as we said at the beginning, you know, we've really found, just using this analogy of where we're sitting now in our offices here at the school, here at the university, we've really noticed the impact of not being able to teach face to face. And that has really, you know, we're quite worried that, you know, we've had 75% of some students, if they're doing urban planning, and 65% of, if they're doing architecture, of a lot of their courses being taught online, and what the implications of that is. So I don't know if it's contrary to that. It's about thinking about the investment that goes with it, what type of scale we're talking about, and what type of movement we're talking about.
Definitely. I think the next question is for you, Lee.
Well, it's not the power. Is not the power of the judge and the legislature empowering the significant problem. Oh, look, I don't want to be seen to procedure, legal opinion is more important than outcomes and the discussion and good planning focus on. I don't want to be seen to be criticising his honour, or her honour, I think it was, whoever. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. You know, I feel like sometimes saying to the powers that be, shall we say, the minister or whoever, a lot of these problems are legislative based in terms of the legislation, and you can't legislate for good practice. And if you don't make that really clear in it's just like a plan. If you don't make it really clear what you're trying to achieve, you're going to get some perverse outcomes. And if we think about how much money we've spent on process instead of outcomes, and that's the critique, I suppose, of what the urban planning profession's done in New Zealand, they've become more process oriented instead of outcomes. Okay? And that's because in many ways we've allowed the legal profession to move into those spaces, and they've captured it and captured it. So I agree with you 100%. You know, but again, that's the judicial system we have. You do have those rights to appeal, and it's not for me to criticise that. That's a bigger question for Parliament. But I do agree with you. We seem to have become more focused on process instead of outcomes, and I think that's the challenge for us. And again, that narrative moving away from, you know, it's about the process. A good process is really important, otherwise you won't get the good outcome, but it's all about outcomes, and that's what it should be about.
We also have some questions in the chat. There's Angie asking about autonomous vehicles, AV technology, which is coming. Should we be thinking planning for AVs? In the USA, planners are cautious about AV as they are seen as a force that work against TOD. For example, people are more likely to sit in AV for prolonged period, watching movies, etc. So are likely to live further away from the places of work.
You go for that one. I know you like that one.
I don't know. I mean, definitely. I think UV doesn't solve the congestion problem. The other aspects of the challenges that we're facing with TOD. I think you're right. Like if it's convenient, maybe people are more willing to do so. There's no drivers, but it doesn't shorten the trip, or it doesn't change the behaviors of the people, and patterns doesn't foster the communities. So that's an interesting observation, an interesting thing to look for. But AV actually used for the public rapid transport. It happened, I think in Taiwan, actually, we have those driverless buses somewhere, and it actually helped. If we're talking about public transportation system using AV technology, I would say that it's a plus. But I think if AV is using for private car vehicles, then it would just sustain the same problem that we're facing today. Yeah. What do you think, Lee?
No, I agree. And just we were saying before, it doesn't deal, and that's the real issue, isn't it? People sit in watching the movie and they sit in the car or they do some work, and it doesn't deal with congestion, and that's you think about, we're used to it eating in New York. The city actually limited the amount of Ubers that could be in the city at any one time because we had this constant flow of cars just taking up the streets. So I think it's a really interesting question, and I'm a bit skeptical about, one, it doesn't deal with congestion. Where does the power come from? New Zealand's really quite lucky in our forebears, not through design, I don't think, but through good measure, have enabled us to have a predominantly sustainable sense of energy production through through the hydro dams and all the sort of stuff that was invested in. Where are those new wind farms? Where are those new dams? Where are all those things going to come from to power these types of things? And I think that's some of the questions we have to ask. And I would say, and I agree with you, a bit skeptical. I'd rather we think about reducing that travel demand and providing the opportunities so they didn't have to travel.
Yeah.
And I think, Jordan, you come back, it is Ventnor Road. Thank you. Couldn't remember. Thank you for where Wallace was.
Yeah, and the next one is, in terms of active mobility, should we be more innovative with providing people a wide array of options to discourage car use and incentivize just sticking to just the widely known bike, e-bike and e-scooter? Oh, I totally agree. I mean, options is everything. If people have options to choose their mode of transport to the places that are connected, meaningful to them, I think people would more willing and likely to take it. But then what are the innovative mode of travel? I don't know. I see those bike bus. Actually, no, the bus bike for kids. In Netherlands, they actually have those bike that carries kids in the morning to school. So it looks like a bus, but then it's actually a huge bike that travels on the road, and it serves certain purposes. And I thought that could be something that is very innovative, but in a way they have the infrastructure to support it. They have their dedicated bus lane, they have wide enough streets, and it's actually safe for them to do so. But here, I mean, Auckland, if we don't have that kind of infrastructure, then it will be probably a bit difficult for people to be willing to do so. And there's so many bike accidents in New Zealand. So that's another concern for people to actually take the alternative option. Yeah.
There's another question here about, in terms of linking every job to a house, would it be difficult to create the mix of jobs? And I think that's part of the discussion, is about, it's about just what Lee Ting said, it's about choice. It's not about us imposing things, it's about creating the right type of mix of employment opportunities. But when we think about employment opportunities, I think we should be thanks Fern, we should be thinking about high-end jobs that add value. No disrespect to, you know, the coffee shop that I talked about before, but how many coffees do you have to make to make that financially viable and a good living wage? And a lot of people do that. It's really, really important. But it's thinking about the types of jobs that we're thinking about as well. I think it's really, really important. And just moving to the other, just picking up that point about choice, it is about choice. And also for me, with that choice comes the obligation. And if you choose to live quite a way out of the system, you know, and you want to commute in from your lifestyle block, you know, halfway to, you know, Wellsford or wherever, that's really, really good. But then why should that then be subsidized by other people? You should be paying the true cost of that travel. And I think there's a lot of discussions we haven't really got into, but I think if we started valuing the cost of travel, you know, in terms of the cost of that infrastructure that we've been talking about, congestion and all those, which we know all that sort of work, I think urban form would change as well, quite not quickly, but it would have a quite significant impact. And again, issues of equity have to be thought through, and that's why we're suggesting, if we think about this movement, it's trying to encourage people so they don't have to move. If they do have to move, so we have to think about the cost of that travel as well.
And especially, I think in our current situation, we're in COVID, it really makes us to think about it even more seriously, because we're changing our behaviors. A lot of things are now going back to what we were used to before, and it's really an opportunity to really rethink about what we can do at this point in time. Like, it's a changing sort of turning point. And it was just interesting that Lee just mentioned how many coffee shops you can have in a neighborhood. I just read this report research. They're using data, sort of collecting people's behavior during COVID, and the research result actually shows that within a place, if there's a larger share of food and beverage, including alcohol production, experience will somehow be more resilient to COVID. So I guess the takeaway from our little talk today is that we think a walkable, car light, more dense with people, with options of activities are the key factors to build a more resilient, sustainable cities. And we're just taking COVID as, you know, a case, a lens to look through this, and then using this as an opportunity to really seriously think about what we can do. Yeah.
Do we have any good examples of type neighbourhoods in Auckland? I think some of the old historical parts of the city, you know, Newmarkets. We were just talking about Newmarket, probably things closest High Street, are probably some of the better examples. Those historical sort of things. I don't think, and that's where I say, I don't think we've created anything in the modern context that really is a good example. And again, you know, Hobsonville, you know, not criticizing Hobsonville, it's probably one of the best design responses that guys at HLC did, you know, more often declining on, of course, you know, but it was all about trying to encourage, you know, there was supposed to be not cars coming out, it was supposed to be cars coming in, it was supposed to be TODs, there was supposed to be jobs there. And I know there's a whole heap of issues about trying to get employment out there and all that sort of stuff. And that was our point about building at the periphery and all that sort of stuff. So I don't think we've done a really good example of that. Really interesting. It's really interesting what Jury South or Jury could be. You know, that could be some serious thinking could go into that. But it's interesting to see how that plays out and whether we actually give effect to the ideas that we're talking about, because that's what we're doing in Jury, is we're actually creating a brand new Manukau city, if you like, trying to create it down there. Are we actually going to deliver on these types of things? So I don't know if we've got a new modern example. They're probably more those historic things they've just turned about, like the Newmarkets and such like. I mean, you know, you can think about New Lynn has all the opportunities, could turn into something. Those surface grade car parks could turn into, you know, that's the advantage of those things, could be redeveloped into more dense housing, more dense options. So the bones are there, but I don't think we've actually delivered one. And that's why we question whether there's actually really one in the New Zealand context.
Totally agree. Yep.
All right. Do we have any other questions?
Yeah, we have more about building code, cost of material. That one, Jordan, what the opportunities.
So what's it say? To what extent you say the building code, cost of materials and lack of specialised construction in New Zealand contribute to the lack of intensive development, which could allow for flexibility use high EIG, high ceiling heights, robust surface and ground floor levels of mixed use. And when it's cheaper and easier to build bare medium, look, you'll totally, I totally agree with what you're saying, Jordan. It's always frustrated me and Eating now that she's joining in, and if Ian was here, he'd be just saying the same thing. We've always talked about housing crises and land supply and all those sort of things, which it's not really about. I mean, it's one factor in an equation. I'm not disputing that at all. But as we've discovered over the last couple of years, supply and change issues, construction costs, skills of ability, it's far cheaper to build a concrete slab, just bang it on, 2-story townhouse, up you go, 75 square meters, bang, off you go. You sell that 700, 800K, wherever, depending where you are, all day long type of stuff. Yeah, and I think that's what you're getting at is the real heart of the issue, is that why is the construction cost so expensive in New Zealand? Why are these types of things here? Where's the skill source? And those are really, really valid questions, slightly bit outside of our expertise as urban designers, but totally understand your point that you're making there. Really interesting. Do we have the skill sets? And I think, as I sort of alluded to before, I don't think you can legislate for good practice. One of our doctoral students, actually Ting and I's doctoral students, is actually looking now at why urban designers potentially post hoc rationalize bad design. What's the thinking behind that? Not saying they are, but just exploring that premise. And why are we doing that? Why are we reinforcing their thing and not challenging these things and looking at different approaches? And then with that, we've said to you, you've got to think about the costs, and it's still got to be financially viable. But it's a very good point.
I think we've responded to all the questions. Thank you so much, and we're almost out of time. I think this is a really exciting discussion. We had a really good questions too, and we hope that you got really key takeaways from this seminar. Yeah. Oh,
so
we have one more just pop up.
Oh yeah, what was that?
Do terrace housing and apartment building zones provide mixed-use zone flexibility, such as the case study example of 333 Main Street in Vancouver?
That's a really good point. You've been involved in some of those projects myself, where putting mixed use in them is very problematic. And that's why a lot of people like those mixed use zones. It does give you that flexibility. You can make them fully residential if you want, or you can provide the CAF, or you can put the gym, or some sort of commercial activity to go into that sort of thing. So there is a question about that, and I think that's some part of the discussion that needs to go forward. And I think, from my understanding, the Auckland Council is looking at how and what happens in those terrace and apartment building zones to enable that, because there needs to be more flexibility. And again, it comes back to that idea that's solely residential, that's solely this. It's about the quality of the design, and I think that's a good question.
Yeah, I think everything takes time, and Auckland definitely is moving forward. It's just, slowly.
What are my hopes for Auckland? What are our hopes? Well, Auckland's my hometown. I was born and bred here. Hope things get better, and I think things will get better. My biggest concerns are about issues that we talked about at the beginning: equity. Who are we doing this all for? Who benefits from all this sort of stuff? And it's ensuring that we develop a city that's open to everyone. That's my real hope, is that we don't have, as I said, I went to high school in Papatoe, in South Auckland. Somehow that's seen as different to West Auckland. I mean, they're all going to be, it's all about the neighbourhoods and that, but it's all about so that we don't have some sort of areas that we don't value over others. It's about ensuring we have fairness and equity across the system, and looking at the quality of the built form that comes from it, because we would argue really strongly that, good design, basic design principles are not so much about what we talked about, construction costs. They're about thinking about where you put the buildings and the streets and all those key design thinkings that urban designers think about that don't actually have to cost much money. And it's not something that only wealthy people should have, I suppose. That's my big thing, and hope that we deal with equity across the city.
Lee, the question had a half end is Auckland Light Rail. It's like, what are your hopes with Auckland Light Rail?
I take the point, and for the people who were involved in the discussion last week, where we were in-house, which was great to be in-house, was maybe there should be investment in movement across South Auckland, for instance, from Mangere through to Manukau, for instance, or Mangere to the airport, which I know the light rail is doing now. And that was a strong reflection of work by the people of that community, and also some thinking from people inside Kaingaora, I have to acknowledge that as well, who really thought, well, if we're going to invest this money, we should be capturing just not people along the side of a motorway, but these areas in Mangere, and then enabling them to come into the airport. So what I'm trying to say is I support this because I acknowledge that we need that movement corridor along the isthmus. Anyone who catches buses into the city knows that it's almost reached capacity. So we need to think about new ways of doing this. My real hope, and it's a shame that we didn't spend as much time as we could have last time, and that's no criticism, but thinking about how we can leverage off those new stations that materialize, what they could be, so that we could talk about everything we talked about, so that we could provide employment, so people could live in Sandringham, they could live in Royal Oak, or wherever these stations are going to be, but then do have the opportunity to come in to study urban design at the university and have that face-to-face experience as well, but still do that. That's what I think is my big hope for the light rail, that does do that and try and remove some of those buses off, Dominion Road or wherever this final corridor is going to land.
Yeah. But Auckland Light Rail would just be the first stage to activate some of the neighborhoods and provide convenience. But what we're really thinking is that it needs more to support those stations. The communities needs to be there, not just the train station. I guess that's what we're trying to say. Okay. Great.
Charmaine, did you want to say something? I don't know if you can talk, actually.
I think we can allow them to talk, but I don't know.
No, I don't know. Anyway.
Yeah.
We'll catch up with you, Charmaine.
Yeah. So I think we are out of time today. And thank you so much, everyone, for attending. It's been a really good session.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks very much. This is the end of this part of Fast Forward. We'll be back in the second semester next this year, where Eating and myself were just thinking about the 3 international speakers we're trying to line up for the next phase, where we move on and we're thinking about open space, linking that to urban form and such like as part of our discussion, aren't we?
Yeah. So we're looking forward to see you guys. Well, not really seeing you, but having you participate next semester as well. Thank you.
We want to pick up some overseas cases, maybe some from the US, some from Australia, to come and speak to us. So again, thanks to our sponsor, Jib, for all the support you've given us. We hope today's discussion was great. Thank you very much.
Good night.
Good night. Have a lovely night, everyone.
Bye.